gets here. My name is Tim Stratford. I'm managing partner in Covington's Beijing office. We have about 25 people there. Our office is not quite as large as this one. It's great to welcome you here tonight for this event organized by the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. I especially wanted to be here to honor my mentor, Jerry Cohen. I was on a plane here with Bill Rosoff flying from China, and I mentioned that I was astonished when I was an undergraduate at Brigham University to have a famous Harvard professor call me and give me some encouragement about studying at Harvard Law School. That, of course, was Jerry, and Bill said, oh, the same thing happened to me 3 years early. He called me when I was doing graduate studies at Berkeley. I can't begin to guess how many lives Jerry has influenced over the course of his career. I said to one of my new partners in Beijing, Ram Reishiak, that I was going to be seeing Jerry Cohen, and she said, oh, please take a present to him for me. When I was studying in Washington, he arranged a position for my husband to be in the States so that we could be together. You can't go any place where you don't find people whose Jerry has touched in remarkable ways. So thank you from so many of us for what you have
done. Tim is a good lawyer, and he knows psychic income is not taxable.
With respect to Professor Vogel, we're looking forward to him arriving soon. He also, of course, has had a great impact on more than one generation of students of China. I think the closest thing that I come to academic achievement is that my name is mentioned in a footnote in chapter 15 of his biography of Deng Xiaoping. For that, I will always be very proud and honored. After that, I'd like to turn the time now over to Steve Orleans, the President of the National Committee, to give more formal introductions. Thank you.
Thank you for giving us this beautiful venue, this beautiful view. Couldn't be a better place to be spending Lunar New Year. I think Tim is, both Ezra and Jerry. Now, Ezra's not here to hear this, but thousands and thousands of scholars on China, lawyers on China, sociologists, historians have had their lives changed by these two people. And I actually learned something in doing research for this program. Now, Ezra's not here to hear this, but it's obviously we're in the waning hours of the year of the horse, and soon to be beginning the year of the, depends what you call it, the ram, the sheep. You guys call it lamb, actually. Goat, whatever you want to call it. But Jerry and Ezra were both born in the year of the horse. And not only were they both born, this is, of course, President's Week. And I noticed that President Washington and President Lincoln, which is why we have this President's Day, were born 10 days apart. And I noticed that you and Ezra were born 10 days apart. So we should have like the China Giants holiday between July 1st and July 10th.
But I am the older brother.
That's right. But it's true, the thousands that have been influenced is true. Ezra has flown in from Washington, from Boston, and is currently, Margot, through the Midtown Tunnel?
Yes, he was at Fifth Avenue at last call.
Fifth Avenue at last call. Doesn't know New York traffic, but hopefully we will see him shortly. So Jerry, the idea was we were going to start kind of have a discussion of the last 50 years, talk about education, talk about the interviews that you and Ezra did in the 60s. So really, I was going to start with Ezra in 1960, but that's going to be difficult. So maybe start with that famous, the seminal work, the criminal process in the People's Republic of China.
Well,
through 1963, of course, when you interview all those refugees. But great to have you here. You also, I should add, there's one other thing. There are very few people in my life that I kind of say, but for their influence, I wouldn't be who I am today. both Jerry and Ezra fall in that category. But for Jerry Cohen, but for Ezra Vogel, I would not be sitting in my chair today. So cheers.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is the National Committee.
Can't hear you.
The National Committee.
It is on.
It is on. In thinking about what we might say today, it occurred to me one of the major themes of the evening should be the role that the National Committee has played in the marvelous normalization of relations with China. It goes back to its beginning, I think about 1966. I wrote a speech for Ted Kennedy, our then senator from Massachusetts. I was at Harvard, that he gave at a big forum that the National Committee convened. And he was out front. And that leads to a second theme I want to mention, which is the relation of China policy and American domestic politics. As the 60s developed, there was a heated race between the Nixon White House and the Democrats, Kennedy and McGovern, for whom I worked, both of them. And of course, Nixon and Kissinger won hands down. I was working both sides of the street. And in 1966, it was very hard to interest anybody at that point. 1967, Nixon dropped a line or two in the Foreign Affairs article that acknowledged we can't keep China out of the world forever. And that was the first clue that he might be receptive. Before our Harvard group got a hold of Kissinger and Nixon, and before Henry joined him, Nixon was already seeing it. He was very clever in the Sino-Soviet split, which is the third thing one should keep in mind, was very important in bringing us together. Steve, interrupt whenever you can, because you know I'll talk 50 minutes. A lot happened in the 60s. I remember a group from the National Committee, I think Doak Barnett was with us, went down to the State Department to talk to a man I'd never met at that point, Arthur Hummel. Hummel was the child of great scholars, you know, of Chinese studies. He'd grown up in China, had an adventurous career during World War II there. But we sort of attacked him. Why was the State Department under Dean Rusk so immovable? Whenever asked about China policy, Rusk had the same answer with a straight face. We have the China policy under constant consideration. And Alan Whiting and others who knew better, they worked in the State Department, they said he wouldn't budge. And that annoyed me because I owe my career to Dean Rusk. It was his idea in 1960 that somebody in the country should know something about the Chinese legal system. And I lucked out. He was proud of that eventually, although I always annoyed him because I was needling him for a change. And when we went to see his Deputy Assistant Secretary, Arthur Hummel, Hummel said something very revealing. He said, look, it's only since the Fulbright hearings, which had been a month or two before, that we saw the American people might be willing to change their attitude toward China. Because in the early 60s, the attitude of the American people toward mainland China, red China, communist China, was not very friendly. In the 1960 November election, several members of Congress who had voted, the only ones who voted, to bring red China into the General Assembly of the UN, not kick out Chiang Kai-shek from either the Assembly or the Security Council, but just bring in China. They lost in that election. And when Ike accompanied Kennedy down Pennsylvania Avenue for the inauguration, Ike said, the only thing that will bring me back into politics after my retirement now is if you move to recognize red China. It was a very hostile atmosphere that was only beginning to change. And when Art Hummel said, It was the Fulbright hearings that recently demonstrated the American people might be ready. I said to him, "You mean it's the function of the State Department to follow Congress and the function of Congress to lead on foreign policy?" And if it sounds familiar to you today, of course, you'll be quite correct. So we had to turn opinion around, and nothing could have been worse in timing, because something happened beginning April '66 called the Cultural Revolution. And you can imagine the difficulty of trying to persuade people to change our policy toward China when China was engaging in a policy that Teddy White's marvelous TV program about the Cultural Revolution called The Roots of Madness. So it wasn't a good, easy time. But some of us, especially academics, were trying to change things, and that's when we organized the Harvard group. We had a Harvard-MIT seminar for a year and a quarter that tried to lay the groundwork for a new China policy, whoever would become president in 1968. And Jim Thompson, who was too quickly forgotten, was the core. Jim Thompson was your teacher at Harvard College. He was the guy who called
the Jesuit.
He was the Jesuit.
Right. Jerry and my introduced.
Well, Jim was a wonderful fellow. He had spent 2 frustrating years working for the Bundy brothers and others as the Vietnam War developed. And he came back to Harvard in 1966. And he mobilized me and some senior people like Ed Reischauer, whom Jim had helped obtain the ambassadorship to Japan. And Jim helped me write the memo that we gave to Henry Kissinger in November '68, right after the election. And that was the origin of the secret trip. I don't think most people have recognized that. Our first draft, first recommendation said the president should ask the Secretary of State to conduct secret, if necessary, deniable conversations in Beijing with China's leaders. But when we saw our colleague Henry was not going to become Secretary of State right away, but Nixon's national security advisor, we put out a second draft, which was our final expression, which said the president should select someone in whom he had the greatest confidence. And we knew Henry would match that description. And that was the origin of the trip 2.5 years later, July '71, that changed everything. And here's Ez now. I'm just waffling, Ez. So you can get it. He was warming up on the 60s. Give you a minute to catch your breath. Ezra was a distinguished member of our Harvard-MIT group when we discussed prospects for a new China policy. And we actually, by then, were good friends because we shared a year in Hong Kong across the street from each other, as Steve mentioned, interviewing refugees from China. And Joan and I would not have found our apartment in Hong Kong had it not been for Ezra, who got there a little earlier and told us there was a place across the street. The '60s for China policy people was a pretty lonely time, but things began to warm up, of course, following Kissinger's secret trip. And the remarkable thing is how quickly, and that's another theme I wanted to emphasize, how quickly the American people changed their mind. Here in '66, it was still a very hostile environment, but by '71, Nixon saw it as the ticket for re-election. And '72, every night after Nixon's February trip to China, I would watch the 11 o'clock news, and it would show night after night the Republican paid commercials of Nixon walking down the steps of Air Force One and the Star-Spangled Banner playing in Beijing and Zhou Enlai shaking his hand. I was working for McGovern, but it moved me to tears every night. And Nixon swamped McGovern, of course. And I felt sorry. McGovern was a very brilliant guy, but he was not a brilliant campaigner. I was his Asia advisor. And he was the one who said, "I'll crawl to Hanoi on my knees if that would get our POWs out." And who wants a president who would crawl anywhere on his knees? Yes, come on.
And you talked about life in Hong Kong that year we were there?
Yes.
You talked about that already.
No, not about refugee interviewing.
Well, maybe I'll start with that one. And now, maybe then I'll come to Fairbank. Have you talked about Fairbank yet?
No.
Okay. All right, maybe you're the boss here, right?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, as Jerry said, it wasn't a great time for China work because it was a pretty dull period. But in Hong Kong, it was really a terribly exciting year. And one of the things that made Hong Kong so great was that people like Herb Levin and other State Department people were there, newspaper people were there, academics were there, and we were all doing the same thing because you couldn't carry on diplomacy with China. So the State Department people were China watchers, we were China watchers, the newspaper were, and we shared a very exciting time. And everything was new. We were discovering things all the time. One of the joys of that era was that we thought about China in the big picture because there were so few of us that when political scientists met lawyers and sociologists like me or whatever, we had a lot to talk about in common. And of course we arrived in Hong Kong in '63. Jerry and I were born the same month. Did you tell them that?
Yeah, I've already told him.
Yeah.
I'm the big brother.
He's a few days older.
Ezra, I had the analogy to the two presidents who were born 10 days, Lincoln and Washington, who were born 10 days apart. I mean, you guys are in the year of the horse, and we're about
Well, you know what the Chinese think about that. But we had really a terribly exciting time, and lawyers were doing interviews just like we were doing interviews. Nick Platt was another one of those State Department people who shared our excitement, and we were learning every day. And because it was just after the Great Leap Forward, of course, Hong Kong people were starving, they were coming in refugees, and they were living on the hill. And we tried to use refugees for interviewing. And at that time, fortunately, in 1962, fortunately for our arrival in Hong Kong in 1962, Taoju and Guangdong decided to let the floodgates open. So an extra lot of people came from Guangdong into Hong Kong. And there were an unusually large number of refugees. Of course, to ask a guy who grew up on a farm and didn't know that the production team next door didn't know the name of the production team next door, ask what the people thought about Mao Zedong was something journalists would do, but it wasn't something that greatly advanced Chinese studies. But we found people who knew about things. Have you told about Eddie Chun yet? Or did you tell about Eddie Chun? You told about him? No. Okay. So when we would find somebody who was really quite objective and knowledgeable, we really made good use of them. And Jerry was trying to build up a caseload that he could put into a book and use for cases, even though they didn't have laws we knew it, to build a caseload. And I was trying to get a picture of society, but there were certain, I found that if you ask somebody, you know, what rationing was like, he might know what his rations were, but he wouldn't know anything about the system. You found one cadre who managed the ration system, and you learned a hell of a lot about how the whole thing worked. And one fellow who just passed away, Eddie Chun, was passed on by Jerry to me, from Jerry to me. Jerry interviewed about legal issues. He had been a low-level cadre and knew a lot. And I found that he knew so much about Guangdong development, and he had an intellectual curiosity, so that we decided that my first book would be about Canton under communism, the province of Guangdong. I originally thought of doing community studies like Jonathan Ungerwood was able to do. But at that time, it really wasn't possible. There weren't enough people from the same place to get a real picture of a community. But a combination of the official paper and the newspaper and a refugee who knew how to read the paper was very useful for putting together a picture of politics in the 1950s, and it enabled me to follow. And there were a lot of things you could do by watching the paper. I think one thing that our young people now don't get enough training in is how to watch little changes of wording. And because we had to do that, we learned skills about what they meant and how to interpret them. When I said, here, they seem to be starting a new policy, and Eddie Chen said, oh my God, they're really going to start a new campaign. Everybody, that means we're going to watch out. And it gave us some kind of feel of what was going on. I remember when I took him first to Harvard Square, and I got him to come to a couple years, and he later got an MA at Harvard. We saw a bunch of raggedy-looking people who were hippies. This was the hippie era. And he said to me, see those people? I said, yeah. He says, are they from the countryside?
As you talk about Hong Kong, by the way, let's jump forward and then we'll jump back again. There's a story in today's New York Times which is called Giving Up on Hong Kong. It's written by somebody who says they don't want their children to grow up in a place where if they demonstrate, they'll be, their careers will be affected, and it's time to leave. What do you guys have seen it for 50 years. You've seen it through riots, you've seen it through the reversion, you've seen it by living there for many years. With that experience, what do you think about the future of Hong Kong?
You want to start, Jerry?
Yeah, Verna Yu is the author of that article. She's not just an average person. She's a highly knowledgeable South China Morning Post journalist specializing on China matters for many years. And she's worked with many of us, and a very knowledgeable person. She's just had her third child, and I think that's probably what prompted that, plus the recent problems in Hong Kong, Occupy Central's fate and all that, had probably affected her. Now, we've seen this before in the early 80s. 1983, when the negotiation took place for the Sino-English joint declaration on Hong Kong's future, a number of people left. I lost my secretary in Hong Kong, Reuben Cryam, who was now a member of this illustrious firm, Covington and Burley, was working with me then, and that's when Daisy Chan left us for 2 years to take up Canadian citizenship. But she came back, and with a foreign passport, however. But it's a demonstration of Hong Kong resiliency. I think a lot of the people who will leave now, and the figures are up, they won't give up Hong Kong entirely, but they are worried about their children. I don't think Verna mentions the fact that 2047 is going to be a big change for Hong Kong. It's already 2615 here. People don't know, is Hong Kong just going to be another Chinese city at that point? The hope was China would have changed significantly and become a much freer as well as more prosperous place by then. It could still happen, but Hong Kong people are understandably cautious, and they do think about their children.
Yes.
I was there last month for the 50th anniversary of the university's service center, which Jerry founded, and I was involved that first year in helping getting it organized. And I've been chairman of the Foreign Advisory Board the last few years. And what I like about Hong Kong is it still has the rule of law. And it also, people are very outspoken and free in what they say. And I can get my book published in Chinese in Hong Kong exactly as I wrote it with no changes. And you can still do that. Now there is some pressure on the media there to self-censorship. If you want to get into China, and you want to get grants from China, and you want to get your kid a job in China, not to be too critical. And there's beginning to be a little bit of that, but still so widespread. I think the big change from 50 years ago is it's not a Chinese city. A lot of the taxi drivers do not know English, and they can mostly get by in Mandarin now. Cantonese, of course, is better, but you can't get by in Mandarin with most of the taxi drivers. But to me, what's happened in Hong Kong, this is the footprint of the mainland is just so big. So when rich people come in and buy up the property, the young people can't, afford to get good housing. The young people in the universities, at Hong Kong universities, undergraduates, they know there's a mainland quota, and only, 25% or so of the undergraduates are now mainland, but they're the brightest in the classes, and the good jobs will go to them. So I can understand why the youth in Hong Kong are very unhappy with the situation as they see all the good contacts, all the good jobs going to these bright young kids. And when you get 1.3 billion population producing bright kids in a population of 7 billion, it's a lot of competition.
There's a shift taking place in Hong Kong. The first shift took place when the Hong Kong tycoons definitely began to become more powerful than the British and other Western capitalists. When Jardine Matheson shifted some of its assets out of Hong Kong, that was a signal that something was happening. Now there's a new signal. It seems to be that the tycoons are losing out in their influence. That's why Li Ka-shing has begun to move his assets outside of Hong Kong, even though he's the richest man in Asia, apparently. And that's because the state-owned enterprises and other investors from the mainland seem to be assuming more influence. There's a lot of internal tension. In other words, not only between the people we read about, the Occupy Central, the intellectuals, the labor people, and the capitalists. Within the new socialist capitalist class, there's a lot of tension. And we don't know how that will be resolved in Hong Kong's future.
I think it's important, two things. One is I think there have been obituaries written about Hong Kong for the last 50 years, and they've all proven to be wrong. So I
fortunate had the
death of Hong Kong prior to '97. And if that all turned out to be wrong. The other is it's important to distinguish between which of these are effects of the one country, two systems, and which are the effects of just China becoming increasingly prosperous and increasingly powerful. You can argue that the media in Singapore would self-censor in their need to continue to be represented in China, that tycoons in Singapore have to toe the line because they have enormous investments in China or in Malaysia or in other places. So I think we have to be very careful when we talk about what's going on in Hong Kong, how much of it relates to one country, two systems, and how much it relates to just China's increasing prosperity and powerfulness.
There is a struggle going on every day within the South China Morning Post, which is still, for me, one of the most important sources of immediate information about China. And within the paper, there's a daily struggle over who will be assigned to cover which subjects, how long the treatment will be of the article, what page it will appear on, and the editorial policy, I think, fortunately, is freer than the control of the newsroom, where the struggle is really intense. And this is nothing compared to what's been going on in the Chinese media. The Chinese media are far more important. And while there are obvious communist newspapers in Hong Kong, within some of the others, there's an ongoing struggle. And of course, some of the people who work for those papers have been injured. And there's a question, does that have anything to do with politics? Was it just accidental? Did it have to do with their personal lives? But there is a struggle going on that we have to be aware of.
But Hong Kong has a lot of people who are not going to give in easily. I think they've become used to freedom. And the Hong Kong University, Chinese University Press publishes whatever they want to. And there are a lot of people who say whatever they want to. And that attracts a lot of people from the mainland who want to have their kids grow up in a more open environment. It attracts a lot of Chinese who study in the United States and want to be in the Chinese world, but find Beijing or Shanghai a little stifling, but find Hong Kong really an exciting place. So I think that in terms, especially now we're going to a period where the mainland is making it very difficult for people to speak out on all kinds of issues.
Of course, we shouldn't ignore Taiwan here because a similar struggle is underway in the media in Taiwan. Some of the biggest newspapers, the Zhonghua Shibao, the China Times, for example, are widely suspected of caving in because of their own owners' investments in China to the PRC side of many questions that have to be dealt with by Taiwan. And that was another theme in thinking about tonight that I was struck by. On the one hand, we've seen all these wonderful, enormous changes since the early 60s in our relations with China. On the other hand, the key problems that had to be dealt with were merely managed in the 70s. We normalized relations with China without resolving some of the issues that are now going to come back to bite us. And that's the status of Taiwan. We're still selling weapons to Taiwan. That was the biggest obstacle to normalization in late 78. Steve was involved in all this. He knows better than the rest of us. And those problems are still there. And with my former student, President Ma Ying-jeou, stepping down next year in Taiwan, people will begin to appreciate his contributions more because it's not going to be so easy to moderate cross-strait relations. Ma has not been a successful politician at home, but he has made a great contribution to world peace that's under-recognized. He has managed, despite Beijing's expressed reluctance to conduct relations with Taiwan negotiations on an even keel, he has managed on an even keel to make 21 agreements with the mainland that have reduced tensions between not only Taiwan and the mainland, but also between the U.S. and the mainland, and the U.S. and Taiwan. And I think Ma will be missed because I don't think his successor, even if it's from his party, the Kuomintang, the nationalists, I don't think he'll have a similar opportunity. So Taiwan is going to be coming back to bite us before long.
As you mentioned your book, Deng Xiao and Deng Xiaoping, and you mentioned that it was published in full in Hong Kong, and it was not published in full in China. Talk about those deletions and why you think they occurred, and what it tells us about today.
Well, I strategically chose to publish it first in Hong Kong for precisely the reasons that we're talking about now. It's a freer place. I wanted to have full disclosure, exactly as I said in English, available to Chinese-speaking people. And the Hong Kong Chinese University Press did that. The lady who runs Chinese University Press, Gan Qi, was a very bright woman who's a wonderful entrepreneur and has very good values. She graduated Peking University, ran a bookstore in Beijing for some years, and she felt that I should make the final decision about which publisher in the mainland, but she gave me good advice about the several she thought were the best. So I had interviews with the best of the presses and decided on Sanyan. And the reason I picked Sanyan is that they were a very reputable academic publisher, and other friends who published with them found them very predictable. And also, they had a good understanding of what was permissible in Beijing. And a book on Deng Xiaoping about the great leader is not going to sneak by easily unnoticed. And so my friends told me they probably got as careful consideration as any book when the censors looked at it. And I made a deal with the Sanyan that if a book was to come out under my name, I had to approve every single change they made. So one editor spent several months, almost a year, going over page by page what he thought would get by. And close to 95% got through without any trouble. And the kind of things that didn't get through, number one, were the names and some of the activities of some of the leaders around Beijing and the Tiananmen incident. The last thing I think the propaganda department wanted was somebody from Li Peng's office come out and say, why the hell did you let that get by the censors? And you can understand why a publisher was somewhat concerned about that. But the people at Sino, they were committed to what I was committed to, of making as much available as they possibly could. And I think there was both a moral commitment and of course, a financial one. The more that the book was able to tell the whole story in Beijing, the better the sales would be. And my friends who've gone through the bookstores where the book is sold in China say the books open up automatically at Tiananmen Institute. And that's what, a lot of people don't want to spend the money to buy the book, that's what they're interested in. And I think the remarkable thing is that so much was allowed to stay in, and they worked so hard to keep it in. To give you a couple examples of things that were changed, I had said in the English version that Mao, I'm not sure the exact words, but it was to this effect, that Mao Zedong had a paranoid fear of people who might take power from him, and was very careful about that. And Sino says, the word paranoid won't go. You can describe what he did, you can describe what he says, but please don't use the word paranoid. So they're not paranoid. On the Great Leap Forward, I had in there something to the effect, roughly 40 million people died in the Great Leap Forward. And they cut that out. And I argued with him. I said, that I gotta find some way to inform them. So the editor comes back and said, how about we put it this way? Some foreigners have estimated it. So as a whole, I was very pleased with what they did. Nobody wants to have a book that's censored, but I think, is the choice to have the book published at all. For somebody like Evan Osnos now, who writes about so many things that are going to be taken out, you can't publish that in China. But the story of Deng Xiaoping, roughly 95% got published, and the other parts that were left out, the basic meaning they were able to leave in. So I was very appreciative of all the efforts. They worked very hard the guy who was the manager of this has written an article. He hasn't published it yet, but said that there was a lot of pressure on him, knowing that he had to please the censors and he also had to please me. And they invested a lot of time in editing and so forth, and we're sure I was going to finally say, go ahead.
As are you following Xi Jinping closely? And one of your colleagues at Harvard said that Xi Jinping is the most powerful Chinese leader since Chairman Mao, which was a very interesting comment because it suggests he's more powerful than Deng.
Rod and I differ on that one, and that we once, and so finally recently we discussed what's our difference, and his was really a formal position. He thought that because Chen Yun and others were roughly equals on the Politburo and so forth, that he was more constrained, and that now Xi Jinping has none of that constraint. And my point really had to do with what's the informal power. And my point was that Deng spent 12 years in the military. He was a military hero. He was the front political commissar at the Huihai campaign of 500,000 people on each side. He had been 10 years in charge of as General Secretary of the party. He had spent a lot of years, 5 years in France, 1 year in the Soviet Union. When Jerome A got sick in '74, Deng Xiaoping met all the foreign leaders and worked with Jerome A. So he had an amazing amount of knowledge. So in terms of knowledge and structure and informal power and authority, I think that Deng had much more. And Xi Jinping, after all, he hasn't studied abroad. He doesn't have that instinctive feel. He doesn't have the seniority in sector after sector and knowledge of foreign relations. And so I think informally, Deng had more power. So Rod said, okay, you can agree with that.
Well, Deng was a brilliant diplomatic thinker as well as economic planner. And he had, as Ezra pointed out, the ability to get people who disagreed with him to allow it to happen anyhow. I think the normalization of relations with the U.S. is the outstanding example to allow it to happen even though we didn't settle all our problems. And again, the settlement of the Hong Kong question the flexibility he showed, whereas Doug would say we should try to be flexible, we should leave things to the future, etc. Xi Jinping's line has been, we're not going to yield on anything, South China Sea, East China Sea, etc. He doesn't seem to have the suppleness yet, and that may relate to his relative lack of power. And of course, the test ultimately of Xi's power lies ahead. He's still got 8 years to prove what he's going to do, as he seems to be gathering more power in his own hands. I think there are echoes not only of Mao in some of his rhetoric, but there are echoes of Stalin in the way he's moving. Not what he's saying, but the way he's eliminating foes and gathering power, even in relation to the number 2 man, his prime minister, Li Keqiang, and others. But I want to hit one theme that relates to our subject of normalization that Ezra's description shows. It shows a abiding concern we have for human rights in China and the differences that we have with China with respect to freedom of speech, due process of law. This was an obstacle to normalization in the 70s. We had a debate in 1978 before the decision at the end of the year. There were people who argued we must not normalize with China until they demonstrate concern for human rights in a way we find persuasive. And there were those of us who said, look, if you care about human rights, you should promote normalization, because that's going to facilitate human rights in many ways for the Chinese people. And even within our human rights community, there was a disagreement how we should rationalize this for the American public. In the spring of '78, John Fairbank, a great man who Ezra and I both owe a lot to, John wrote an article in the focus section of the Washington Post saying we should normalize relations with China and don't worry about human rights. Chinese are different. They don't worry about human rights the way we do. Well, I agreed with his conclusion, but I didn't like the way he expressed it. And I wrote a piece the next week saying, just because we should normalize relations with China doesn't mean we should read the Chinese people out of the human race, because Chinese people also like many of the basic freedoms that we do. And this is going to enhance their opportunity to exercise their rights. Well, in many
Who was
ways,
right, Jerry?
Pardon?
Who was right?
Well, I was about to say, in many ways, we have seen life has certainly improved dramatically, in large part because of the opening of China that we Americans played a role in. But we're still facing the reality that human rights, civil and political rights, not economic, social, cultural rights so much, are being repressed. And it's another one of these continuing problems that we have to continue to manage. And Ezra's example is an illustration of managing, getting our information into China. I just got an article published last week in the Peking University Law Review. Well, the poor editors in Beijing who had to negotiate that, not only because of the merits of what I said, etc., but because I have a certain track record that makes me look not too friendly in some quarters. But they did it. So it's a constant struggle, and we're still facing that problem as well as the problem of what to do about Taiwan.
I would just add that it's important that when we talk about that, we put it in the context of the difference in China when we moved there in 1979 and today. It is night and day. You can argue about political and civil rights, but you cannot argue about the human rights of the Chinese people having been improved almost beyond comprehension, Jerry. When we went, you couldn't choose where you lived. You couldn't choose your job. You couldn't choose anything. There was no right to make any decision. You were fun pay. You were assigned all these things. You couldn't get a passport. You couldn't travel abroad. The list of couldn'ts. We couldn't travel. We needed a Lu Xingzhen. We needed a travel permit to leave Beijing. Jerry and I needed that. Today, I can go anywhere and do anything I want. Chinese are free to travel. We saw, what, 600 million people, 700 million people travel in the last 72 hours for Lunar New Year? We need to look at them. Yes, there were problems, and we should continue to advocate on those problems, but we need to put it in the context of what has happened over these 40 years.
Also, the fear in 1973, when I first went to China, I tried to stop somebody on the street and ask directions. And they were so frightened, even though I had somehow communicated my poor Chinese, but they were just so scared they ran away. And my strategy in order to get around our minders was to take a walk early in the morning before they got up and before they got out. And one of the first days I did that, I found a police car pulling up. Somebody had seen a foreigner in the street. Obviously, that wasn't to be done, so a police car came by to sort of check to make sure what I was doing.
That's another thing we shouldn't neglect. Humor. So many funny things happened in the course of our initial contacts with China. I could give you a string of funny experiences that happened to me in my effort to befriend people in China. And then the other way, we brought the first Chinese scientific delegation to the United States in December '72. They were afraid to come. They've been reading the Renminbi Bao, the People's Daily, which said crime is terrific in the United States. You can't walk on the street safely. And I kept telling them, you're just reading the wrong propaganda. You're going to be safe. And their first stop was Boston. We put them up at the Ritz Hotel. After a nice lunch, I said, well, let's go for a walk down Newbury Street. And the head of the delegation said to one of my friends on the group, no looking at stores. I said, don't worry, we're just going to walk ahead. I knew my Chinese friend wanted to go into a camera store and buy a camera. But I said, it's going to be all right, don't worry. We start walking down Newbury Street. We get into the second block. And then I saw the only cops and robbers chase I've ever seen. Literally, there was a policeman with a gun drawn, fired, stopped the thief. The thief ran into Bonwood Teller. The Chinese looked at me and I lost all credibility. We also took them to Harvard the next day, and I invited only people who could speak Chinese. I'm sure Ezra was there. And then the Chinese thought, everybody at Harvard speaks Chinese.
As I had CCTV on this morning watching the Lunar New Year festivals. They cannot run an hour show without having a bit of anti-Japanese propaganda. As kind of the leading expert on both Japan and China, what is going to happen in this relationship, and how do you fix it? What needs to be done to kind of make this less of a problem?
Well, one of the things I hope to do if my health and energy hold up is to do a book on the history of Sino-Japanese relations from the beginning of history, to try to provide perspective. Until now, all my books have been written with the American audience in mind, and some of them just got translated and did well in other countries. But this time I want to have a single text for the American audience, of course, but also something that can be read in China and something in Japan. What I want to say to the Japanese is, look, you have to be more sensitive to the views of your neighbors and the sufferings that they have gone through, and find ways to deal with that suffering. And I want to say to the Chinese, look, you know about Japan from 1931 to 1945, but you don't understand Japan since then. You don't have a sense of history. You don't know the Tokugawa period where they had 270 years of peace. And you don't know how much after World War II, the Japanese wanted peace and how much they have done. I'm afraid right now that we don't have the room to have big improvement. I think there's a little improvement. I think that the experience at APEC was that, and the dangers of getting in military conflict was sufficient that Xi Jinping wants to avoid conflict. And so now there are lots of delegations, and there are lots of Chinese and Japanese meeting with each other. This last week, I think it's the last week, 1,000 Japanese business people went to South Korea to meet with South Korean counterparts to try to get things started. And they're not going to go to China right away. They're going to come back and then send a delegation of several hundred Japanese businessmen to China. And so they will begin working. And I think at the local level, there are a lot of Chinese ready to work with them. Even when students were throwing rocks at Japanese in Shanghai and at the residence of the Japanese ambassador in Beijing, a local party secretary would take the Japanese factory owner in his area and say, what can we do to keep your factory here? What do we need to do to make it work? And there are a lot of Chinese now who realize that Japan has a lot to teach them, not only about quality control and environmental control, but how do you keep a stable society? How do you keep a peaceful society? And the fact that there are more rich people in China now means that tourism in Japan is going to go up. And even in the last year or two, when relations have not been good, tourism continues to go up in Japan.
I think here we have another theme we should recall from the past that's highly relevant to what Ezra has just said, the role of business. I get very annoyed when we have these discussions now about what to do with North Korea, because we're so dependent on information that comes out of the White House, the State Department, and the Pentagon. And often that's right, but often the perspective is limited and insufficient. And the great thing that business did, as well as cultural exchange, starting with ping pong and sports with China, is allowed many more Americans to look at China. It opened up our perspectives, gave us more information. Same thing happened eventually with Vietnam, but we haven't reached that stage. And of course, the North Koreans are tougher to deal with than the Vietnamese and Chinese were. But I think the role of business, and with Japan, I think we shouldn't overlook the continuing economic importance of Japan and China. I used to represent some Japanese companies in negotiations with China before Japanese lawyers saw there was a market. And it was very, very interesting to see. Chinese are practical people. And of course, they didn't love the Japanese in principle. But in negotiations, in business, etc., they knew they needed cooperation with Japan. One of the funniest incidents I had was the early negotiations over how much should China pay Japanese company for the transfer of technology. And the negotiations would go like this. Chinese side would say, look, we know your technology is valuable, and if you insist, we'll pay you something for it. But just remember, in the Tang Dynasty, we gave Japan your language, history, religion, literature, law, everything that makes life worth living, and we never charged you anything.
It was mainly the Southern Song.
Since we've two incredibly illustrious careers, I'd love to ask this personal question, and you're the role models for thousands. Is there anything you would have done differently if you could go back and rewrite it?
Well, I would have had more time doing language earlier because I didn't have, I got responsibilities and went up the ladder too fast. And I would have asked for a year or two, say, intensive language training, because I felt as a sociologist I need to interview, and I did this both in Japanese and Chinese, so I had to keep at it, and I've had tutors all my life, and it's been a strain, and it's been like, running with one hand behind me, because I felt I needed to do that. I can now give lectures in both, but it's been a real struggle to do that, so that's the only thing I would do.
You didn't have Jerry Cohen telling you when you were graduating from Harvard, your Chinese stinks. Go and live in Taiwan amongst the Chinese for a year and a half and come back when you're ready.
When I think what I would do differently, it comes out long before I studied Chinese. I started my career as a lawyer at Covington and Burling in Washington. and after a short time decided I'd become a prosecutor. Now seeing this glorious setting, I think I should have stayed at Covington and Burke.
One of the things that Terry and I hear is that both of us had experiences before we got into the China field. And we had it based in a way now where we have better training. We can get a graduate student who has Chinese and law or Chinese and sociology as a graduate student come out ready to go. But I think both Jerry and I were the generation where we were lucky to have that base first. And so I had done sociology field work first in the Boston area and then in the Japan area before I came to China. So it gave me a comparative sense of how you go about things and a perspective that is more than a lot of our young people get. So I'm thankful for that part. It delayed maybe a career and I didn't have this. But the main thing I would have done is more language. I had the good luck of having a 3-year postdoc. My friend Marion Levy used to say I was the highest paid overgraduate student at Harvard. But I had a 3-year postdoc where I could do Chinese language, history, and so forth. So I got a good start as a postdoc, even after I'd already done field work.
You're only allowed to have one answer to this question. What do you think the biggest problem in the U.S. China relationship is? You can't go economic, that you can't give me 7 things. What's the biggest problem?
Joe and I said in the late 60s, early 70s, Taiwan. I would say the same thing today.
I would say it's the Chinese leadership doesn't have a good sense of how much they need to have freedom and openness and goodwill around the world to accomplish what they want to accomplish.
Why do you think, let me follow up on that. Why do you think that, let's take blocking of websites or visas for scholars, where the Chinese will deny a visa to a scholar who's written things that they are extremely opposed to, or the New York Times is blocked, or Bloomberg is blocked. And the Chinese leadership understands they pay a price for doing that, yet they choose to do it. What do you think they're thinking about in making those decisions? What is it that they see that we don't see?
Well, they grew up in a society that had propaganda and where people had limited access to information. And I don't think they realize how different that is. And I think now that China is so aware they want soft power around the world, they're going to fail. They're going to fail because they want to control the information and control the media. What they should do is give more freedom to more foreigners to come and see what they think, because they're not going to persuade people. They're going to create a lot of doubts. And ultimately, it's unsustainable. They might be able to get by for a few years by having strict limits, but people are going to get information and they're not going to be able to do it. So to me, it's that. I think the Americans now realize that China is going to be a power and we have to engage with them, have to work with them. I think in balance, although there's a lot of people who want to make China the big buggy bullet threat and a reason for having more weapon systems. I think that as a whole, the Americans are ready, but the Chinese have a misconception of what they need to do to win the goodwill around the world.
I think it's pathetic that a government that has been so profoundly successful and that has made the world fear China as not only a rising but an already risen power has to go to the extent it goes to stop its people from hearing and learning certain things, especially when they're doing it inconsistently. It is true the Times can't publish in Chinese, and it's true that some other papers can't, but some can. The Financial Times, without appearing to make concessions to Chinese censorship, continues to have a Chinese language website. So it's it's inconsistent that makes China look pathetic, and I don't think it's going to be effective. I think you should have a more confident government, but I think Tiananmen frightened them. The fall of the Soviet Union and the East European communist states frightened them. and they have a hold on power, and they're determined to take every step, even those we think unnecessary and irrational, in order not to take any chances. And I used to think Lee Kuan Yew was so silly because he was afraid of people who had long hair. His 2 visits to Harvard in the late 60s, early 70s frightened him. And he was not as confident a leader as I thought he might have been. It's the same thing now with the leaders in China. I think they're excessive and paying a price that's not worth it to them to try to stamp out free speech. Things are worse today than they were under the previous Chinese administration of Hu Jintao. And I am very depressed about that. Many of my friends are in jail. And it's true, everything Steve says about most people who play the game are benefiting. And it's also true the gap between rich and poor is very great. And you're getting a sense of injustice that is spreading in China for various reasons. But they really should do better. And eventually they will, but how long it'll take, how many thousands of people will spend their lives in jail, it's sad.
Cultural revolution, when you listed the things they were afraid of, I think we often forget that the current leadership came of age during the Cultural Revolution. And if you experience that firsthand, the way the Chinese leadership has, all the members of the Standing Committee, you were afraid of any level of instability. So you will tend to overreact. It's not to excuse it, but it's to understand it. Last question, then I want to open it to the audience. What do you guys want your legacies to be? If you could pick one legacy, what do you want it to be? The thousands you've educated?
Well, of course, my hope is that eventually, despite its enormous size and problems and population, that China will develop something that we associate with the genuine rule of law, that is subjecting the government to standards that would limit its power and reduce the likelihood of torture and arbitrary action and arbitrary censorship. And we've seen this happen in Taiwan. We've seen this happen in South Korea and some other of the Asian countries. And Japan sort of led the way. And I think there's no reason that eventually this can't happen. Now, that's not the most likely future for China. I was thinking today, what are the models for China? What is going to happen in 10, 20, 30 years? And you look around the world and you see different possible models. The one I see is the one I look around and see in Taiwan and South Korea. On the other hand, you can look at Egypt and say, is that likely? Or even Libya. I mean, one of the reasons the Chinese leadership put up for their dictatorial conduct is China can't be held together in any other way. And would you see a return of warlordism, etc.? There are many possible futures for China. But obviously my legacy, I hope, would be eventually achieved, which is government under law.
My legacy, I hope, will be is increasing understanding. And I don't mean just knowing the facts and being able to take exams, but deeper understanding of peoples with each other, and also of the systems that make it work, and to try to imagine systems so that these people, very different people, can somehow work together. And part A has been to train your own students and your own people at Harvard. And part B, I have the unusual good fortune now. The only person I know who has written a book about Japan became a bestseller in Japan, and a book about China that became a bestseller in China. And so I want to increase understanding between China and Japan. I think I have a kind of a special responsibility and opportunity. And so that's the part of me that I would like to concentrate more on the next 2 or 3 years than anything else.
Margot was telling me that we agreed to have questions from the audience, so I've overstayed my time. So let's open the floor to, Chung Wei Man right here, and then put up your hand, and Margot will give you the phone, the microphone.
Chung Wei Man, China Today. Steve asked my question. First, Xin Yin Hao. Steve asked my question, the same question, China, Japan, for Fu Jiaosou. So I'm just going to ask a question for Hong Jiaosou. So, I remember interviewing you 5 years ago. I asked why you still work so hard, 80 years old, in the office, 6 days a week, and you said, I bet on the horse, I bet on the horse 50 years ago when most people thought that horse had no chance of winning the race. Now the horse is coming down the track fast. Am I going to walk away? It's crazy. I'm having a great time. I just want to ask, you talked a little bit about, I remember you said there was no rule of law in China, when you started China in 1960. But now the fourth plenary session, obviously, the rule of law is the main thing, and you talked a little bit just a moment ago. So what do you see, how do you interpret this fourth plenary session's rule of law? What's going to be like?
Well, the fourth plenum of the Central Committee that was held last fall, followed by a year the third plenum. And both of them have begun to develop a theory that emphasizes the rule of law, the rule by law, but the more we see, there's a special meaning to words in China, as we've known in studying communist societies before. What they seem to mean now by the rule of law when they talk about independence of courts must be bolstered, they seem to mean that the party and the government should reduce the adverse bad influences that exist today on local courts. Local courts, to make a decision, confront so many influences other than the merits of the case. Corruption is obvious and very serious. Local protectionism is a very serious problem. Guanxi, the relationships that judges have and party people have and local government have, it's very hard for judges often to focus on the questions legally before them. And what the party now wants to do, and they have a very able new Chief Justice succeeding a man who really knew very little about law but knew what he liked. And what they want to do now is curb all these adverse influences on local courts. That would make the local courts more independent of these influences. But they don't want to make them independent of the central party. They want the central party to tell the courts what to do, and they don't want to have any static from local power holders, etc. And it's not that they want the party to have nothing to do with the legal system. Every speech they make makes it very clear. The party's got to control the judiciary like it will control everything else. The center must govern. It's a federalism type problem. It's a struggle between the local government and the center. That's what they mean by the rule of law. It's the use of law as an instrument of power by the central regime, and that has been the great Chinese tradition.
My name is Fred Wild. I had the privilege of being the Canadian ambassador in China in the early 90s, and I've gone back regularly. I very much enjoyed your conversation, especially the early days, and I just for a very brief moment, I will mention that Canada opened China.
But Pierre Trudeau got his element at Harvard Law School.
Harvard strikes again. I was very taken by all three of you, referring back to the old days in China, your experiences there and how much it has changed. My own experiences, I agree with everything you said there, but my own experiences, having gone back just last summer after a 5-year absence, I concluded that the biggest change is in the new generation. My wife and I had the pleasure of traveling to 12 different universities. I gave lectures in all of them. There is an entirely different generation that's been created. They are not at all like their parents or their grandparents were. That generation, when it reaches the power, it will use it differently. It's got to. I'd like to have your reaction to that.
I think you're right. If we talk about normalization this evening, we should acknowledge the role of Canada. When Canada in October 1970 established diplomatic relations with China, that broke the ice, and it provided an opportunity for those of us in North America to meet regularly with Chinese diplomats who were not yet permitted to come to America. Huang Hua became the first ambassador in Ottawa, and many of us would go up and get acquainted, try out ideas, etc. And there was indeed a kind of competition among some of the political scientists and myself about who could spend the longest period of time with Huang Hua. And Huang Hua was very polite. He would never end the session, but he would wait until you had to ask where the men's room was. And so what you had to do when you met Huang Hua is not drink anything.
I had the opportunity to travel a lot in China a couple years ago when I was doing book tours, and also went to a lot of universities. I've been at least 2 or 3 times a year ever since Jerry and I, well, ever since 1980. The way I would describe this new generation, first of all, the proportion getting into college has increased so much that they're not all going to have elite careers, and only a small portion of them. Some of them now see that businesses, they're a little worried that with China reaching its economic peak and beginning to slow down, there may not be as good jobs, and some of them would like security above all else. And so a government job or a company that can provide long-term security is a consideration for some of them. I think that some of them already, who are the brightest, think they're past the stage where they want to go to finance and high government jobs. And a lot of them now are thinking about environment, about what they can do for the poor people, what they can do about human problems. That's not the majority yet, but it's a new group. I think as a society is past the stage where everybody has to scramble to get a decent living, and there are a lot of comfortable people. And so I think there's a new group, including Xi Jinping's daughter, who majored in psychology. And now a lot of that new generation are looking for ways that they can make a better world. And I think that's going to be something that we can hang on and work with.
Having devoted your lives to communicating, trying to get Americans to understand China better, we have heard Xi Jinping is going to be coming to the United States this September and will likely have an opportunity to address the American people. In just a few sentences, what should his message be to the American people?
I think his message should be that we realize that this is no longer one nation dominates the world. We have to work together. We have common problems. And here are some of the issues we're going to work on. And we accept international rules. We feel that we deserve a bigger place maybe at the United Nations. And if you can't provide enough investment funds, we can build new investment funds and new banks that provide investment. We can take a greater role, but we are prepared to operate within the basic guidelines of the international system and to work and find a way to work together, and that's in both our interests. I think that should be the basic message.
That's a great answer, and I like your question, Steve, because we should end on this, because we have to get on with China in the world. And many people are worried that China will not accept the rules of the game, even those they've taken apart in developing, like the law of the sea. Those rules under the United Nations Covenant on Law of the Sea were not foisted on China. China played a prominent role in the early 80s in their negotiation. And China made a mistake after 2007, after cultivating the nations around them. We began to see a new attitude on the East China Sea and the South China Sea that worried many people. And I think the leadership, Xi Jinping and company, now realize they went too far. They're trying to moderate their position verbally, even while quietly continuing to work toward building bases in the South China Sea on various reefs, etc. But I think they're going to be more diplomatic about the extent to which they accept the rules of the game. But we have to get on with them, and we have to also reciprocate and respect. Earlier there was mention of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB. The U.S. attitude toward that is just stupid. We should be welcoming that bank. We should be not trying to persuade Australia, Thailand, and South Korea, etc., not to join. This is a benighted attitude on our part. So we can't ask that they demonstrate, not only speak about, but demonstrate respect for the international community, whether it be climate or cyber or what have you, but we have to respond also. And as a major superpower, our record in respecting judgments of the International Court of Justice, etc., has not been without blemish. So I think both sides have to work harder on how they deal with each other. And Xi Jinping, it would be good if he could show greater awareness of that.
As Jerry, I want to thank you for tonight. I want to thank you for educating thousands. I want to thank you for your contribution to the U.S. China Relations.